Hi everyone, I hope you don't mind me sharing this baking video, dressing gown and all, but I got up one Saturday morning recently and I started to put a loaf of bread together and I thought, some people might be interested to see this. I should share it. My whole grain sourdough recipes, they change all the time and often I'm using up random flours and grains, which can make for some creative bread making. And for this casual weekend bake, I used a couple of different types of whole wheat, some whole spelt grain and some unusual black barley grain. So this is a good example of the kind of bread I make all the time. I'm going to show you a couple of little cheats that you can use to get the best out of more challenging flours. And it's just a good general example of my kind of everyday bread that I thought you might like to see. So I've got my flour milling there and I'm just writing down my recipe as I go. I don't generally use recipes. I tend to make all of my loaves up as I go, but I'm recording this for you guys to share. So I've got 600 grams of flour there in total. And I'm just milling that in my Mockmill, but you might be using store-bought whole grain flours and that's totally fine too. While my flour is milling, I often like to add in some seeds. I don't usually measure anything. I just put in some linseed there, some whole linseed and some whole white sesame seeds. They give a really lovely flavour. And then often when I'm using non-standard flours like the barley flour and other weird and wonderful flours like that, I often put a bit of psyllium husk into my dough and that just helps to bind it and give it a bit more structure. I'm also adding my salt in there, 10 grams of salt for a 600 gram flour loaf. And now that I've got my flour milled, I've got all those dry ingredients, I just mix them together really thoroughly. And then I like to make a well in the center of the flour, and this helps to mix the starter and the water together. I've got this little chart that I use that I made for myself with hydration because I make my recipes up all the time. It helps me to work out how much water to put in for different flour amounts and different desired hydration percentages. So for this recipe, I'm making it around about 85% hydration, which is by my chart 510 grams of water, but I just went with 500 grams of water. So I put my water in. That's cold water, by the way, because the flour is warm from the mill. I like to use cold water. And then I add my sourdough starter, which just came out of the fridge. I add that in there with the water. And then lately I've just been using this little hand mixer that I bought really, really cheap from my local supermarket actually. It was like $15 or something like that. And it is fantastic for mixing my bread dough. It is the most easiest and convenient way that I've found to mix my dough for ages. And it actually does a pretty good job at developing the gluten. You can see that this dough is really quite wet and sticky, and that's okay. I have edited this quite a lot, but I did mix this for about 5 minutes, and you can see by the end of the mixing that it does become a lot firmer, and as the gluten in the flour does develop a bit more strength. But you can use another kind of mixer, or you could just do stretch and folds or hand mix your dough. It's probably too sticky to knead, but you can use other mixing methods. That's totally fine. I just like to get the mixing all done in one go rather than having to come back every half an hour and do stretch and folds. Lately, that's my modus operandi. So here's my recipe. I've added my salt and my starter and my water amounts. Now that my dough is mixed, I feed up my starter for the next bake. So I usually just leave a little bit of the scrapings in the bottom of the jar, and to that I add about 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. I mix that up and let that ferment alongside my bread dough for the day. And then once it's bubbled up, I put the starter jar back into the fridge, ready to go for the next bake. That is my very easy, low maintenance sourdough starter management method. It has worked for me for a very long time now. So there we go. It's 8:10 a.m. the dough is mixed, I just need to let it ferment now. Because it's winter time here in Brisbane, our houses are quite cold. It's actually warmer outside than it is inside. So I just turn my oven on for 1 minute and then turn it off again. And that just helps create a little bit of a slightly warmer environment for my dough to ferment. And 6 hours later, pretty close to 2 p.m. Oh, hi, Kevy. I take my dough out and it is pretty much ready for shaping. Whole grain sourdough bread never looks very spectacular. You don't want it to look like it's doubled in size, or it'll probably be over fermented. But you can see that there's a little bit of a wobble to this dough and it feels a little bit airy. So I'm going to shape it now. I'll show you in a second what I mean. I've just got my bread tin there greased with some cooking spray, and I'll just shape up the dough now. If you look closely at this dough, you will see that it is fermented, because you will see the little air pockets and you will see the little, it'll be very subtle, but you will see the little stretchy gluten network. When you see that and the dough feels a little bit kind of puffy, that's when you know that it's ready to shape and that it's fermented enough. So I just do a really basic shaping. I just gently sort of pull my dough together, and then if I'm baking it in a tin, which is a good idea for this type of loaf because it will probably spread out a fair bit if you try and do it outside of a tin. And I just roll my dough up to fit the tin, and using wet hands so my hands don't stick to it, I just pop it in the tin and pat it down, and that's a really nice basic shaping method. For the final proof, I always put my dough into a closed container so that the surface of the dough doesn't dry out. You want to make sure that you don't dry out your dough. And please ignore the time on that. It is not 4:26 a.m., but it is 19 degrees Celsius, which is like about 68 Fahrenheit, I think. It's quite cool, fairly cool for our climate. So the final proof, because of the cool day, it was 3 hours I let this sit. And this is the thing with sourdough. It is so flexible. Every day is going to be different depending on your dough temperature, your room temperature. So you've really got to just go with the dough. And you can see I'm putting the bread tin into a cold baking dish there. And I put that cold dough in the cold dish into a cold oven. This is a really good everyday baking cheat that you can use. I just put it all in cold and then turn the oven on for 1 hour and it bakes the bread. It is so good. It kind of finishes off that final proof and bakes all in one step. But I did take the loaf out again because I forgot to score it. I do like to score my tinned loaves just because otherwise they get a bit misshapen and they tend to break on the sides, and they look nicer if they're bursting at the top in the middle rather than on the sides. I also forgot to spray some water in there. That does help create a bit more steam around the dough. So trying again, we'll put the cold, everything's cold, into the cold oven. I set my oven to 220 degrees Celsius or 430 Fahrenheit and bake that covered for 1 hour. Here we are 1 hour later. The bread is baked. It is completely beautiful. The house smells great. And there you go. You've got a really easy, no fuss, 100% whole grain sourdough bread. It's just such an easy way to not only mix it and shape it, but also just bake it in one step. You don't have to do all these different steps. You just put it in cold and it comes out perfect after 1 hour, as long as your oven is hot enough. So there you go. There's the recipe again. I will put all of this detail in the description box for you. So if you want to get my amounts and the timing for my cool day, you can check that out below. And here's my starter at the end of the day. It's all bubbly, so it just goes back into the fridge for the next bake, which is probably going to be 4 or 5 days away. It takes us usually, 3 to 5 days to eat a loaf of bread. And here's the bread the next morning. I just decided to cut it up to show you the insides. It's you can't really tell from the lighting here, but it's actually really quite a lovely texture, and it's great for sandwiches, especially while it's fresh if you cut it thin enough. And it makes lovely toast, and it's so fragrant and flavorful with all those seeds. It's absolutely gorgeous. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you got something out of that, and I will see you again next time.